It looks like we are live. Welcome to this panel, Behind the Scenes of AEM with SRE Guild members. We have 1 hour for this panel, which is a lot. Often I'm granted less time, so I was very happy that they accepted this time. We'll be taking audience questions, starting maybe 15 minutes in. If you have questions, I would say if you have good questions, there are no bad questions. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tab, which is, for me, it's on the right of the screen here. If you put the questions in the general chat, they might get lost. So please use the Q&A. And we have Denis Moret, one of our colleagues, also SRE, filtering the audience questions and feeding them to me. And I have the final decision. So I take the blame for any questions that we won't take, but we'll try to take many of them and, try to keep that informative. So with me, I'm very happy to have on this panel, go in the same order as on the title slide, Joerg Hoh. I've known Joerg for many years via Apache Sling, CQ, AEM. We've been working together for quite a long time now. Tom Blackford, which we've also been working together from time to time with Tom, not very often, but it's always a pleasure. And Peter Acsai, who I know a little less than the other ones, but I'm very happy to get to know you better during this panel. So the topic is really, when I started, I said, okay, I'd like to do a panel with our SRE folks. And people said, we have nothing to say. It's all deep in the bowels of the services, and we do the plumbing and stuff, and people won't be interested. And I'm sure people will be interested, but we'll try. My angle is really to say, take this from the not the philosophical angle, but almost, what's actually an SRE? It's a pretty new profession. What do you do? What are the challenges? What skills you need? And I think that can be pretty interesting. The one thing is that we will not be taking any product or product strategy questions. This is not about where's AM Cloud going in terms of am I getting this feature or not? We won't take those types of questions. It's really around the SRE's mission and vocation, I would say. The what you do and how you do it. So we'll have people introduce themselves to start. So I'm going in the order which is on my screen. So Tom, you're first. Briefly introduce yourself, where you are connecting from, and why you think I asked you to be on this panel.
Great, folks. So yeah, my name is Tom Blackford. I'm in the AEM Assets on Cloud Service team, reporting to Nico Zimmerman, and I'm the SRE within the team. My background with AEM goes back to 2010. When I was working at a client. So I was originally a client of Adobe with AEM, and then gradually I've worked my way towards the center of the product. I was a client, and then I moved into Adobe Consulting for a few years. And then from consulting, where I was an architect, I moved into Adobe Managed Services and started focusing on the AEM Assets product and how Adobe Managed Services hosted that at scale, specific tunings and skills and monitoring we needed to do specific to assets, customer topologies, to enable managed services assets to scale. And I did that for a few years, and then I was lucky enough to be asked to join the Assets Cloud Service team, and I've been doing that ever since, with a focus on the operational side, scalability, performance, and the like. And so I would hope that what I bring to this is that I've seen it from all perspectives to some extent. When I first started with AEM, we were hosting it on premise, and we built a team with competencies around hosting CQ5.2 as it was then. And then, I brought some of that to managed services and learned a huge amount about the varied customer uses of AEM. And then now in the assets team within AEM as a cloud service, in my SRE role, I'm trying to bring that experience of the different perspectives and real world customer usage to bear on the future of the product. and how we host it and manage it and operate it in cloud service.
Thank you. Very cool. So very broad experience, which is really nice to have in our teams, and yeah, and that's why we met from time to time. I'm doing a fairly different job, but it's great to meet people who are, keeping the trains on time, so to say. So Jörg, how about you?
Yes, I have a similar background with Tom, although mine would even date a little bit more back into the past. I started as my career started already with this thing called Communique 3.5 in 2005. At this time, so it was it was the grandpa of this AEM6. That means it's even a more ancestral of AEM as a cloud service. And I started also on the customer side, and then eventually during the beginning of the CQ5 era, I joined Day Consulting, and then afterwards Adobe Consulting, where I spent, I think, 10 years in the consulting world. And I was also, as Tom, where I was coming from an operational background, and then I grew into this architect role and built up many on-prem environments and also really huge ones. That means it gave me a good learning opportunity to understand what qualities a product needs to have to run it on scale, not running on just, let's say, 5 or 6 unicorns, but running 500s of them. And this, we need to spend a good amount of work into that to make it really work, but eventually we will succeed at then. And it's now perfect. Well, I wouldn't say it's perfectly running, but it's running very good. Yes, and then I also got asked, okay, do you want to join the engineering team operating AEM or doing AEM as a cloud service, both from a development and also from an operational point of view? And it's a unique opportunity because it gives you the way to, much more than in consulting, it gives you the way to scale your work. You're not just dealing with one customer, you're making one customer happy, but you need to make hundreds of them happy at the same time, or you can do them and you have to make them happy. You just cannot focus anymore on, okay, what are your requirements? But you have to look at all of them to make them all of them happy, and not just one or a small bunch of them. And yeah, that's my background, and probably the reason why you asked me to participate.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah. So also someone else with lots of history with AM and CQ. And Peter, how about you?
Hello, I'm Peter Acsai. I am a senior site reliability engineer and a co-founder of the AM as a cloud service SRE guild at Adobe. I've been working initially as a software engineer for more than 15 years, and as an SRE now within that for the past 8 years. And at Adobe, I've been leading several initiatives to improve incident response, automation, reliability, and availability. So this is, let's say, our SRE Guild mission is these global improvements, these large-scale improvements that benefit all customers.
Yeah. How many people are there in that guild, Peter? About 20, is that 15, 20?
About 20 now, actually.
Yeah.
We are growing.
Yes. Yeah. So
Yeah,
go ahead, Tom.
Sorry, I was just going to say, one of the things that's really great, I think, about the guild is that it's a mixture of people like Joerg and I who come from an AEM background, and people like Peter who come from an SRE background, and it's the meeting of the minds. And because we have, those of us who've operated AEM on premise or in managed services have a set of ideas and experiences about how certain things should happen, but it's great to feed into that with modern ideas from elsewhere in the tech industry. and make sure that we're, that we're not just going down a rabbit warren of how we've done things in the past. Sorry for interrupting.
Yeah, that's very cool. No worries. To put my, so I'm, as I said, I do a slightly different job. So my title in Adobe is principal scientist. My name is Bertrand de la Creta, in case someone needs help to pronounce it. I often say that I don't work for today, I work for tomorrow. So currently I'm working on the new APIs and thinking to almost ignore what we're currently doing and say, okay, what's the ideal thing that we'd like to do, and then try to reconcile that with the reality of things. But I've seen the same evolution because I was involved in the initial version of CQ5 in 2000. What was that? 8 probably, and yeah, at the time it was really on premise, and we were proud that you could run a big website on just 2 servers, and with high traffic and stuff. And totally, today the context is totally different, and we're still running the same thing with some adaptations, of course. But it's interesting to see this evolution, and I think that's exciting. One question that I had, so SRE, that's a fairly recently create, at least at my scale, it's a fairly recently created job. And so when you were a kid, that was probably not your dream job because it didn't exist. But I was wondering, what was your dream job as a kid, and how do you think maybe your childhood activities influenced your decision to become an SRE? Were you the person who liked to who would spot things that didn't work, or who would like to fix them? Let's start with Joerg this time.
Good question. Actually, when I applied for my first job, I wasn't sure if I should apply for a developer or for an operation job. I ended up with more operation focused and then turned back into development, and then just switched between back and forth. So I was always, now I think SRE is like can be a good mixture. I mean, you can just work on the operational side, but also you can be hands-on and try to fix the things which annoy you in the operational world. Yeah, and paying attention to the small things is something which I had to learn over the time. I grew up on a farm, and I made my fair share of mistakes. And I actually, I was not always on the fields of my family, but I was also on the neighbor fields, which shouldn't be at that time. And that's the learning curve you need to make, and then you learn to focus on, okay, here, that's the thing you need to do, and not just spreading around and wandering around and, okay, here's nice or here's nice. Well, you have to do something exactly what you're expected to do, and it gives you a little bit of leeway. But I think that's, so looking from the backwards, I think it was, I moved back and forth, but eventually it trended towards this SRE thing for me.
Yeah,
I think that was a little bit natural.
Yeah, I think working on a farm, the good thing about working on a farm is that it's very concrete. In the evening, the cows need to be inside. If not, you
Yes.
have a problem. And I think you learn to. I used to work, at some point I worked for Swiss Television, and I love the fact that, if the news are at 7:30, the news are at 7:30. If you have a problem at 7:25, you don't start arguing. You fix it so something happens at 7:30 that looks like news. And I love this concept of, let's not argue about why it's not working. Let's fix it or do some magic so that people are happy, even if it's not fixed. And I like that very much. So how about you, Peter? Any activities in your childhood or youth that brought you to this SRE mindset?
Yes, thank you. So I was always fascinated with computers and automation. So if I had a chance to use automation or computers to simplify my life, I took that. So I printed out class schedules. I recorded scores in tabletop games. So I was lucky. My relatives had a Commodore 64, so I could start quite early in my career, in this career. And I actually had even the opportunity to learn about the importance of backups after a power supply failed. So that already started me on the path to SRE.
Yeah, that's a great way to learn. Yeah. I started myself on the Sinclair ZX81 or microprocessor. I forgot which one, but a long time ago. And but one thing I remember when I was in school, I was not sure what I was going to do, and there was a specialist who would talk to you and try to orient you to the right profession. And I was hesitating between being a motorcycle mechanic or doing electronics. And he talked with me and said, I think you're better. Electronics will be better for you. But I always like to take things apart and see how they work, and that's interesting. You need that. So, how about you, Tom? Any childhood or youth activities that steered you toward this profession?
I suppose so, yes. So I was very into drawing and music as a child. And I was convinced that I was this creative genius. As I grew up through my teenage years, I realized that actually I wasn't really. I was a terrible musician. But I was able to work with musicians to shape what they were doing. And I was more constructive than creative. So I could record someone's work and polish it up and get it into a complete piece of music much better than I could play it myself. And so I realized at that stage that oftentimes I got more pleasure from working on polishing something existing to get the best out of it and make it into a fully formed thing, rather than having the raw ideas and the creativity at the start of it. And so throughout my career, I think that's led me to the kind of nuts and bolts and getting the fundamentals right, when it's easy to write the most elegant solution as a developer, but if you get the operations side of it right, then there's just no point. So I've always ended up steering towards those tasks within the various roles I've had, especially with AEM actually.
Yeah, I think the great thing with working on the operations or SRE side is you enable people to do fantastic things with the services that we're operating, and I think that's very rewarding, because when you see a website or you see friends or your mom using. Okay, my mom she turned 90 3 days ago. She doesn't do much internet, but when you see people, like older people using internet and it works well, and my code is behind that, or that's one of the sites that we're operating. That I think it's very rewarding, and I think that's a creative operational side of it, which is really cool. Yeah. So we have a first audience question, which actually is close to the one that I had. In AEM, we combine product code and customer code, which is a bit crazy if you think about it. We actually run customer code behind the fence, on our side, and it's a challenge. I think we're doing pretty well. It's working. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of we are discovering things along the way, but it's working pretty well. And someone's asking, how do you deal with sites that are performing poorly, even if autoscaling is working? So if the performance is bad, how can we find out that it's on the customer side that the problem is, and help the customer fix that, even if our service is working is working correctly? Who wants to take that one? Joerg, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest thing what we can do, because typically we know our product quite well, and from an SRE perspective, we know, well, not everyone knows the product in the same way as good. That means it's not always possible to do this thing, but then to tear apart or tell apart, okay, this is product and this is the customization or the not product. And it's not always that easy, because imagine you're doing the same thing when you are on-prem. You have probably a much more focus on this one because you're focusing on a single system, and you maybe have more time to focus on this, while we are focusing on hundreds of individual systems with each customized to its own level. It means it gives us not that much time to investigate in each one of us. What we are trying to do is we have tools available which allows the customer to do a good part of that stuff on their own. We give them the tools, log files. Also on some dev environments, they have even more access than on the production environment. So it's something which is one of the harder parts. Well, the consultant in me which still says, well, let's dig into this problem. Let's spend a day on it, and I'll come out with a list of 10 items you can improve. Actually, I cannot improve anymore. I just can give you recommendations. In the past, in consulting world, I would have committed it probably by myself, but now it's just I give you a bunch of things. But it's not. We cannot spend so much time. So in many cases, it's just that you as a customer probably need to do this work also on your own. We cannot fix or improve your application in a way that it performs very well, because we are not the application experts. We don't know your use cases typically.
Yeah, right. Just forgot to mention the question was from Tad Reeves. So thank you, Tad, for your question. Someone wants to add to this, to Joerg's answer? Peter, yes, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. So in general, if you have such a service which mixes customer code and platform code or service code, I think there are a few challenges that you need to address. So first is detecting regressions, and if there is a regression, attributing root causes. So here it's important that you instrument the platform code to be able to tell where is a regression found. Is it in the customer code, in which case you need feedback to the customer, and of course the associated communication flow? Or is it in the platform code, in which case you would then internally handle it with the developer teams? So this is one which is important, is if there is a regression, where is it? A second is because the customer code can be very different between customers. How do you deal with resource allocation, resource requirements? So for example, CPU, but even memory or networking, right? The customer code can do many things, and you need to be aware of the different resource requirements. And finally, when you wish to scale up, so not 1, not 10, but thousands of customers, then it's important that you can, let's say, compartmentalize. So take the platform code as much as you can in a uniform package, and get the common stuff together so you can deal with them on a larger scale. And the dynamic or the customer specific things you can deal with dynamically. So you need to a bit separate these two so you are able to handle them at scale.
Yeah, and it's so from my architecture point of view, this is an evolution that I think we are doing now with AEM services, is to take out of the AEM processes as much as we can. We did that. I think the best known example is the asset compute, the compute for the images, which previously happened in the AEM process. On-prem, it worked, or you would beef up the machines when you needed to ingest lots of assets in a cloud service. That wouldn't work. So we have taken that out of AEM, of the AEM process, and implemented that as a separate service. And I think we're looking at doing more of that, because that helps isolate those differences, or compartmentalize. That's a difficult word, as you were mentioning, Peter. But I would segue into a related question, and maybe this one for Tom. How to get the right balance between firefighting, just mitigating incidents, and doing the actual root cause analysis. That's I suppose that's a constant tension in your job.
Yeah,
is that correct?
It's a great question. Yeah, and it's something that I personally always struggle with because as Joerg says, we all have a tendency to dig in and really try and get to the full RCA of everything if we can, but distributing the load of that work is quite a significant challenge. I mean, it's vital that we get to the RCA of things so that in the long run we can improve the robustness of the platform and the service. I think without that, that's perhaps something that we've been less successful with in previous iterations of AEM. Issues were sometimes worked around better than they were fully understood and then resolved in the product itself. And we're trying to take a very different perspective in cloud service, I think, rather than expecting the customer or their customizer to navigate around pitfalls in the product. We need to learn by performing these RCAs and remove those pitfalls from the way, improve the product such that customer usage is safer and we don't get a recurrence of the same thing. And by doing that, we then reduce the level of firefighting ultimately as well. So it's a constant challenge, as you say, to make sure we divide our time appropriately between them. I can't say there's any kind of definitive answer to how best to do that. We just rely on management and product management to make the right judgments when a judgment is required.
Yeah. Very similar to, when in software development, it would be good to have some phases where you look at your technical debt and try to reduce it. Say, okay, now for 1 month, we work on technical debt and fix that. And that might be a similar thing. But of course, then systems are running at the same time. So you can't say, okay, everybody goes off and does root cause analysis now. And I understand it must be a challenge, but that's interesting. But how much? Maybe I would ask this to Peter. Yeah, I understand you're more the pure SRE from your background here. How much problems can we realistically catch up front before the code goes into production? Any thoughts on testing tools or techniques that help catch as many problems as possible?
Definitely. So most of the problems can be and should be caught. And there are many tools that help in this. So as a general rule on why we want to catch problems early, the cost of a bug, cost of a problem escalates the longer in a deployment process it stays. So if it goes all the way to a live environment, obviously it's very expensive for everyone and a very bad experience. So the earlier we catch it, the better. So as I mentioned, there are many tools, starting with unit tests, integration tests, that should already give you a good coverage. A CI/CD pipeline that should also cover all of your components, all of your services. And when you are rolling out, using feature flags, so you are able to turn on and off a specific change, a specific improvement or feature, and multi-phase rollout. So you are not rolling out globally immediately everywhere, but in several phases, starting slow. And when you're rolling out, then use dev environments, stage environments, instead of going directly to prod. So if you catch a regression in a dev environment, it's much better than seeing it in prod.
Right. Yeah. So test early, test often. And yeah, it's
Yes.
correct that the initial tests, like unit tests, are much cheaper or much. I think it's also interesting in terms of feedback loop for the programmer. I think it's very good for this feedback loop to be as short as possible. Sometimes,
yes.
If you're programming, if you had you should have an SRE on one side, on one shoulder, and a customer on the other side looking at your screen and say, no, this is not going to work. It's hard to do, but sometimes if we can reproduce that with the tools, that's very useful. Yeah. We have an audience question waiting, but let me just see if I had another one on testing. Okay. It's again for Peter, I think, because you suggested the questions when we prepare them. I understand we have both internal SLO, service level objectives, and internal ones at the component level to avoid customer-facing incidents. Without disclosing secrets, can you tell a bit how that works?
Yes, thank you. So external SLOs would state the level of service that we provide our customers, our objectives that we provide our customers. These are typically externally measurable, externally visible, and treat the system as a black box. So for example, error rate, latency, uptime. So these are what the customer sees, these are what the user sees. And in a system, there are, let's say, multiple internal systems or internal components working together in the background to provide the level of service, and they have dependencies on each other. So for these dependencies, internally, we need to define an SLO. What are the expectations for an internal dependency? So these are the internal SLOs. They are based on components, internal services. They can be even in different areas of the organization, different teams, so managed by different teams. So they need some interface between each other that guarantee the level of service. So for example, a storage backend or a message delivery platform, or even the networking infrastructure or the deployment infrastructure that helps you deliver at the end the level of service to the customer, but it's not directly measuring the customer experience. You still need to act on it if it goes out of your defined bounds. So
yeah, there's
internal SLOs help us with these internal dependencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lots of moving parts. It's complex systems that we are operating. So I think reminds me. So as I said, I was trained in electronics because when I did my engineering school, it was the first year that they were doing computer classes, and pure computer, and I didn't want to be in the guinea pigs, so I took electronics, but I also did programming in the projects and stuff. But I remember, when you have an electronic board, at least at the time, it's probably changed a bit today, you always had these measurement points. You have your electronic boards, and then there's a number of pins where you can put an oscilloscope or a multimeter and find out what's going on in there. So in the end, it's similar to that. You have this really big complex system, and you want to have measurement points with objectives, with gauges that go off, alarms that go off if anything goes wrong.
Indeed.
So that's that must be fascinating to see when you see all that live, and I don't know if you ever feel that you're mastering. That we say to be happy, an engineer needs autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So if you feel that you're mastering this system, it must be very, very rewarding, I think. The next question is for Tom, also from Tadris, from the audience. Can you give an example of a performance reliability triumph using Tad's terms with a cloud service customer without naming the customer, without disclosing secrets? We have to be careful. A big site that would be challenging to run on AM on-prem, but that worked well on the cloud service, and why? What are the elements that make the difference?
Sure. I'm probably best qualified to answer from the assets perspective, so I'll give a somewhat asset-centric answer if that's okay. But something that I would have been involved in in my consulting days, which would have been a project that a customer would have had to pay Adobe for, would have been like a large-scale asset migration, and that would have required considerable gap, because while the product has always fundamentally been scalable, sometimes with things like this, it was necessary to fill a bit of a gap to achieve your specific objective in ingesting, 20 terabytes of assets or something. There would be specific skills required from a customizer, often consulting, to provide, to enable that to happen stably and performantly and reliably. And often customers would have to pay consulting for that. In my time in managed services, as the AM assets subject matter expert, I'd often get called in to advise customers on that because advice was necessary, or sadly, sometimes to assist when customers have got into problems with things like that. And, you know, one of the things that's I've really enjoyed so much with cloud service is that all of the time we were doing things like that, particularly in managed services, we were passing information on to engineering and learning from things that worked and which didn't work. And a lot of that then came to bear in features we've deployed within cloud service and the way they're operated and monitored. So now we have customers in cloud service performing sort of 20, 25, 30 terabyte migrations into the platform without any assistance using our bulk ingestion tool. In the past, there would have always been a certain percentage of assets which weren't processed properly, sometimes catastrophically bringing down the server or causing other operational issues during the migration, which would make doing something like that not only a something you'd have to pay skilled people to do, but also you'd be adding an element of risk, and you'd be concerned that maybe your day-to-day usage of the platform would be impacted as well by doing a migration like that. In cloud service, we've got our ingestion and processing tuned now and implemented to such an efficient way that customers can do these things without it being a project anymore, without there being any impact to their ongoing usage of the platform, ideally. And esoteric image formats, huge files, 20 megabyte PSB files, Photoshop large documents, are no longer a concern for us in the way that they would have been even 2 or 3 years ago in managed services. So I feel that, yeah, we're letting people do, because of the work that the SRE and engineering teams have done, we're letting people do a lot more with the product every day without having to pay for consultants or technical specialists to help them. And that, from the assets perspective, feels like a major step forward, I think. Does that answer the question, hopefully?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And what kind of scales have you been coping with in terms of number of assets, of total size, or?
Oh, I mean, we have customers who've ingested 25 terabytes plus over a weekend, and I remember in my consulting experience, that would be a serious engagement would have been required to get that volume of data in. So yeah, it's a step change, I think, that we've offered with things like that. And it would have been a serious engagement to get the data in, and then a serious engagement to analyze all of the assets that didn't have renditions because of some oddity that was upsetting the image processing that we had before. Now, with Asset Compute Service, we're using best of breed technologies, Adobe proprietary technologies, and we're instrumenting and monitoring it, so we learn very quickly. We don't have pervasive issues across the customer base in quite the same way we would have done in the past with things like image processing, which is a very challenging area because of the variety of image formats and tools for creating them that exist.
Yeah, I think that the fact that so as far as I know, Asset Compute runs on serverless infrastructure, and I think that enables us to run be very specific. One format might be processed with a totally different container than a different format, and I think that's a huge plus compared to before, where you had to run scripts, and hopefully the OS that it was running on was performing correctly, and the FFmpeg version and stuff. Having that in containers, I think, is a godsend for those kinds of processing operations, right?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, FFmpeg being particularly challenging in the past, getting all of the right codecs installed and the latest versions of them. Yeah,
right. Yeah, so now it's all split into different containers, as long as you have the right container for the right image format. And it's been, because it's shared, it's also been used for other customers. I think that's a huge benefit of the service. So it was really a good idea to take that out of the end process in many respects. Yeah, that's a great example, because it's been a big challenge, because when we designed CQ5 more than 10 years ago, it was really, there was no question, it was on-prem, so it was very different context. So then Some things are a bit harder to remove from the end processes than others, but this one was really good idea. Yeah. I have a question of slightly changing gears a bit, or changing topics. I have a topic in this panel which is called defensive programming and observability. So as I said, I'm more on the architecture programming side, and sometimes I wonder what can we, or I also been teaching before. Before joining Day Software in 2007, I was teaching at an engineering school, and I'm still involved with student projects from time to time. How can we teach the new generation? What should you take into account in programming or in programming classes? And so this is a question for Joerg. You've been working in projects very extensively before, directly on customer stuff. And what do you wish you had done differently in your programming career? Now that you see things from the SRE operations point of view, any concepts or things that we should take into account generally?
Yeah, maybe I can reframe the question a little bit and ask, what would I have expected 10 years back from my colleagues in engineering to do? Yeah, I think one of the biggest things, especially, I think Peter mentioned it already, is the feedback loop. That means one of the worst things you can do is you can build today some feature, spend a month on it, commit it, it's working, it's tested, you are running it through CI/CD, you're starting the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and then you eventually, people start using it. And then you got the feedback and say, oops, well, what did I do? I forgot totally these cases because we never were aware of them, because we are not, well, for example, in the asset case, we never dealt with such strange formats, but our customers do. And now we need to come up with a solution. How do we deal with, well, we have FFmpeg and we need to process PSD files. So I think that the feedback loop, having a really short feedback loop is crucial. And feedback loop starts with testing, test cases, but also, I think, bringing your code into production, into real life usage as soon as you can, because everything else you tend to forget, and you, in the worst case, you pile up stuff on that, and later on you detect, well, the foundations are not correct, and that means you can almost throw away everything and start from scratch. And that's my thing, what I would just everyone to ask to consider. Get feedback. Not, yes, testing is good and nice, but and necessary at all, of course, but getting it into the hands of someone else who is treating this differently is always huge.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, Peter, from your long time SRE point of view, any recommendations for programmers, for architects on the, like people my age who come from a embedded systems and on-prem background?
So my first recommendation is a bit different, is that consider SRE as a direction to go in. I think if I have heard about SRE earlier, then I would have definitely done that earlier. And SRE is not advertised enough, especially for starting engineers, that this is an option, and it's actually a very impactful and very rewarding option to do. And otherwise, when let's say working on a product, on a large-scale system, that it's a big benefit if you can move iteratively and start with an end-to-end MVP as soon as you can. So you're exercising all parts of your system, your build system, your deployment pipeline, everything with this MVP, and go from there, iterate from there. And then you already have working solution where you can test your monitoring, you can test your operational architecture is working correctly, your CI/CD is working correctly. So you already have something that is end-to-end, and don't get the surprise 2 months later that, hey, I didn't consider this part.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it's the same. So I consider myself as a hands-on architect, and you know, I've always been wary of PowerPoint-driven architecture, and I think it's the same thing. When you design a system, you should, you should strive to have a working system as soon as possible. And it's also so much easier to discuss. Joerg, you were mentioning feedback. It's also so much easier to discuss with people when you have something that moves. Like now, I'm in a working group for APIs. And okay, you can discuss APIs on paper or API styles, you know, but then if you have a prototype that does something, it's so much easier for people to see it and play with it and imagine how, you know, how they if it makes sense or if they would be happy to use it. So yeah, I think it makes total sense. Yeah. In the same range, so maybe this question would be for Tom. In terms of observability, how can I, okay, let's say I'm programming a new module. What's the right level of observability? Should I add as many metrics as I can imagine, or are they some that make no sense, or how do you see that?
I think it has to go hand in hand with, I mean, there has to be a value for them, and you have to be able to relate them in some way to real customer usage. One of the, just briefly harking back to the previous question, I think, because I think it can go hand in hand with this. One of the things that I would advise anybody is think ahead of time what the limits are for the service or solution you're building and test to them and apply those limits. And that's something we've had to learn, I think, with cloud service, particularly because with an on-premise solution, to some extent, the limits are driven by the infrastructure. And legitimately, perhaps you could say to a customer, well, if you want to do that 10 times more, then buy 10 times more infrastructure. With cloud service, it's completely our responsibility because the infrastructure is hidden from the client. And so we have to know with every service and every feature what the limits are we will support and make sure that it works. And we have to have sufficient observability and monitoring to know that our assumptions in those areas were correct and that we've tested the right things and that we're not getting into uncharted territory, because that, or untested territory. And if we are, then that's when we learn from those, the observability that we've put in place and start doing some work to bring things back under control. You know, we instrument quite a lot of things within assets around customer downloads and processing, and we're always learning from what we're seeing around how best to shape things under the covers. And that's the power, I think, that cloud service gives us, that we can be rewiring things under the covers without the customer noticing in a way that just wasn't possible before in on-premise or even in managed services. And so we have to have enough observability and metrics so that we can make those decisions and shape things. You know, that might be how a download archive is built, for example, at what point it becomes offloaded to another system, at what point it happens on the AEM instance itself. We're intending and constantly tuning those things to optimize them best to the customer use cases.
Yes, all based on observing and instrumentation of what happens to have a real feel. As you were saying, Joerg, in the end, the final test is putting your stuff in production with enough observability that you can find out what it's actually doing. Does any of you have a story of case where metrics or instrumentation produced unexpected results where you thought this metric, no, it's probably not important, and then it was a key element that made something surface? You have any such examples? This is an unrehearsed question, so I'm putting you on the spot. Or the opposite, a metric that you thought would be very useful and found out to be totally bogus or brought no interesting information.
I think I might have one for the former. We instrument and record a lot around the interaction between the CDN and AEM, and that's brought into our infrastructure, our logging analysis infrastructure. And earlier in the year, we were able to pinpoint and eventually resolve a very obscure connection issue between the CDN and the infrastructure on which our AEM as a cloud service runs at a very low networking level. But we were only able to do that because we had sufficient instrumentation to prove to all of the various parties, and this is where I think it becomes very useful, prove to everybody that there really was a problem and that the problem might be in their bit. If you don't have that level of data, it's very easy for issues just to get passed around indefinitely because you can't, for want of a better word, you can't pin it on anybody. And so I think, yeah, the level of information we collect from the CDN layer might have seemed unnecessary, but it suddenly, at some points, but it suddenly seemed extremely useful earlier in the year when we did that. And, you know, by proving the issue, we eventually solved it to the benefit of all of the cloud service customers.
Yeah, I realized. So we were saying, okay, it's a pretty complex system that we're operating, and I would say it's also pretty complex in terms of people. If you draw a graph of the people involved in this story that you're telling, Tom, I suspect it would be a somewhat complex graph with people answering to different managers or different companies. And that's yeah, and that's where you need evidence that you can agree upon. Say, okay, this is the evidence, and do we agree that there's a problem? So yeah, that's very interesting, kind of human systems aspect of the whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah. As we are on stories, I was wondering. First, I hope you all slept well. You weren't dreaming of mistakenly deleting some BGP records in our in our systems. I always like to hear horror stories about our job. I'll tell you mine. So the one thing I did which was clear operations in my career, I used to work for a company called Boschung Mechatronik here in Switzerland and Germany. They did, for example, they did the automatic spraying system for the Munich airport, where there's a bridge at the Munich airport and there's an automatic spraying system when it's icy. And this company, it's a very interesting system. And I was working for them to do the visualization for their road measurement systems. And it was installed in the whole of Bayern. And the communications at the time was by one copper cable alongside the freeways. So it was very slow. And we were still sending configs to all the systems. And at some point, I sent a whole wrong config. So the system next to me, crashed. And I realized that that wrong config would be sent all over Bayern. It would take like one day, and we'd have to drive everywhere and fix, restart all the systems. So that's my slow system horror story. Do you have any interesting or enlightening horror stories in your job? Again, without disclosing any secrets, but I'm sure things happen sometime. Yes, you.
I was at one point when I was my first job. I had an admin account on the production system, and this is sometimes I never want to get again. And because I had enough permissions, I was tasked, in the after hours, after work at 9 o'clock, you go to the system and you update the product logos of 80 tenants. I think it was 1,000 tenants actually. And this was all done manually. And and you click and click and click and click on, I don't know how often I clicked. I said, yes, I need to, and this was CQ, and a communicate as mentioned, and it always had the same kind of activation rules as we have now. I had to reactivate the root pages. And actually, with 80 tenants, I clicked not activate, I clicked deactivate. And then, that shouldn't happen. Okay, let's activate this page again. Okay, went home, everything fine. Next morning, I got a call. Well, we basically removed 80 tenants from the internet. Because you did not reactivate it, but you just activated the homepage. And then I walked to my boss, I'm really made. It was my fault, actually. It was my fault. He said, well, might be your fault, but, well, why didn't they automate it? Why didn't they do it themselves? So it was a little bit then relieving and saying, well, I did the error, but in the end, I think I was told that they spent the rest of the week activating the pages again. Hopefully a learning effect for everyone. At least for me, it was. I never, in consulting, I never wanted to get any account on any production system. I tried to avoid as good as I could.
Yeah, if you can avoid that. But someone has to have these root accounts here. And but also, you could say that only people who do nothing don't make mistakes. So it's human. Anyone else wants to tell a fun or horror story? We have like 3 minutes left. Yeah, Tom. Briefly.
This is pre my AEM days, I think, but in my previous IBM life, I was once on site at a customer environment using somebody else's computer and with a very unfamiliar, I think probably CVS client. This is even before Subversion, and managed to misunderstand what remove repository meant. I think I thought it meant remove it from the client. What it actually meant was remove it from the server. And so I deleted the entirety of the customer's code base and history from their CVS server at the time. I mean, I'd like to think as a consultant, what I was really doing there was providing them with disaster recovery consultancy and making sure that their DR process for their code base was up to scratch. And they had a few problems. They eventually pinned it on me when they realized I'd been using this chap's computer at the time. He was off that day. But we got to the bottom of it in the end, and they fixed the problem. And I suppose, as you say, with all of these things, you learn something from them. And I learned a lot from that, both in what to click on, but also how to design software so that the end user doesn't make mistakes like that. And I'm sure they learned something about securing their source control system a bit better.
Yeah, I think that's part of our task, to design our systems and services so that they are foolproof, because every one of us can be the fool at one time or another. So have a way to fix it when that happens. Yeah, so we are close to the end of our session. Thank you to everybody who attended, and thank you very much for the panelists, especially. It was great to have you and exchange on your work and all it is that you're doing, and the fantastic work of keeping the trains on time. A last question, I will ask this one to Peter. As cloud native systems are becoming the norm, do you foresee big changes in the way we design systems? Any emerging technologies or languages or whatever that you think will make a major difference?
Yes, so I think it's cloud first, or if you think about cloud first, it's a very different world where you have to, from the start, think about how your system is going to behave in a distributed manner. So this is not anymore one method, one function running, but many of them in parallel, having to be synchronized to each other, not in conflict with each other. So it's a different type of mindset that you need to work with from the start.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, distribution. Thinking. I hope that teachers in engineering schools are aware of that, and that students get exposed to that early, because it's if you do a sort algorithm, it's easy to think, okay, nothing else happens while I'm doing that. In today's systems, it's not like that. Your sort algorithm is fighting with image processing at the same time on the same container or the next door container, and that can be a problem. Okay, so we are at the end. The program of the conference continues. I think in 15 minutes, there's a keynote. Thank you very much for the panelists. Thank you for everybody who attended, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.